The Mazda CX-5 has been around for quite some time now, but it still remains one of the best-selling models for the brand here in Malaysia. And so for 2024, Mazda has updated the CX-5. There are now new bumpers, new headlights, a slightly revised interior, but more importantly, the question we're asking today is, can this old dog learn some new tricks, or is it just a little bit too far behind? My name is AIMAN I-ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the 2024 Mazda CX-5. Now for the 2024 model year, there are some very minor aesthetic changes. So for starters, the front bumper has been completely revised. We don't have any fog lights anymore, and the grille surround is now thicker and they end in these newly revised LED headlights. The LED headlight design has also been revised, where we now have a new, slightly more emotive LED daytime running light signature, but they now come with adaptive front lighting, which is not matrix LEDs as I initially thought, but instead they are swiveling headlights that follow the direction of the wheel. The other thing that's new with this latest update are the colors. So we now get this platinum quartz color that you see here, as well as an updated red, which is now even deeper still, as well as a darker gray, which I think generally does suit the CX-5, but the original palette of colors still remain. Now down the side of the CX-5 there are no changes at all, which unfortunately means that the CX-5 continues to soldier on with the lock and unlock button for the doors. Mercifully, this car does come with walk-away lock, so you only have to touch it when you approach the car. What is new for the latest update are the wheel design. So for this, which is one of the highest spec models, we get a set of 19-inch alloy wheels with a dual tone finish, wrapped in Toyo Proxys tires, and they, I think, suit the CX-5 pretty well. I don't quite like directional alloys at the best of times, but I think that with the platinum quartz and this wheel design, it fits. It's pleasant, which is what the CX-5 is supposed to be. Now the changes to the rear are very similar to the changes in the front, where there is a reprofiled rear bumper and a new set of tail lights. Now I previously didn't quite like the CX-5 because I felt the tail lights were a bit too small. They make the car look a little squinty. But now with this new taillight design, it stretches a little bit further into the tailgate and it does make the car look a little bit better. Now they have actually been upgraded over the vehicle before it, because now you get LED indicators as well compared to the outgoing model, and to me I also think that the taillight design looks a little bit more distinctive than before. Now behind this tailgate you will find a pretty good amount of space. The CX-5 has never disappointed in that regard. Now back here you will find more than enough space for 5 adults worth of luggage, even if you're going away for a week. This is a very large, very practical car. And of course, underneath the boot floor, for which you have to remove the rubber mat, you will find a space-saver spare wheel and enough room for all of your emergency tools and stuff like that. Now the rubber matting does, for better or worse, come as standard, because that's just the way Burmaz does things. But mercifully, while the coil mats remain, there are some changes inside which I think do make the new CX-5 a little bit more livable. Now I say that because on the surface, things in here may not seem to have changed, because the dash design remains the same. A lot of the trim pieces all remain the same. There's still this lovely brushed aluminium everywhere. There are still physical knobs for the HVAC controls, which I appreciate hugely. And more importantly, in this context, there is somewhere for me to hide my sunglasses. But what has changed, as I mentioned earlier, are the comfort features. So for starters, these front seats now come with ventilation on higher spec models, and they are very strong indeed. And there's also an upgraded head unit. So unfortunately, while the operating system remains the slightly older generation Mazda MZ-D Connect system, the screen itself has been upgraded. It's now an inch wider, and now the graphics and all of the apps and so on load up a little bit faster. This is especially useful when you're using Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, which unfortunately is wired via a little USB-A socket in the central tunnel, but at least everything responds quickly enough. Now Mazda says that this is a touch screen, although no matter how much I touch it, nothing seems to happen. I have put it in park, I've put up the handbrake, I've done every possible permutation, and I cannot get this thing to respond to touch inputs. I suspect that might have something to do with Android Auto not being touch sensitive. Mercifully, however, the instrument cluster hasn't really been sort of fettled with too much. It's still a semi-digital, semi-analog system, which I think is a great way to display information. And in typical Mazda fashion, there are only about 6 different functions you can access from here: Trip A, Trip B, and your ADAS functions, and so on. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a perfect layout because you get all the information that you want very quickly, and everything is very easy to read and very easy to understand. Now, on higher spec models like the one that we have here, we also get paddle shifters, which is great for the 6-speed automatic gearbox. We get automatic wipers and automatic lights, all very, very nice. And of course, there are a bank of buttons here to control various other ADAS systems, as well as this car's automatic start-stop. Now, because this isn't really much of a touchscreen, of course, you have your MZD Connect system controller down here, which includes sort of your knobs and buttons and switchgear. And I appreciate the fact that when you have Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, if you hit the music button or the nav button, it goes into the respective app on the display within Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, rather than bringing you to an offline version, which I appreciate hugely. It makes this a lot more intuitive to use. There's also a volume knob here, which makes it very easy for the passenger to have to adjust the volume instead of something there or asking the driver to do it. Now, in terms of practicality, there is plenty of space. There's a 12-volt socket here. There is space here for a phone, including a wireless charger. There are very large there are very large bottle holders in the doors, as well as relatively large cup holders here, which are big enough for this very large bottle. There are also more storage space in here with a little tray for you to put smaller items like keys, as well as a relatively large central bin for more items. And of course, you have a relatively large cubby here, which is even felt lined, so that anything that you put in here isn't going to rattle. Now, this is all in keeping with the fact the CX-5 does appeal hugely to families, and so this has to be a practical vehicle for families and all of the flotsam and nonsense that comes with that. But despite that positioning, everything in here feels really upmarket in a very typically Mazda way. All the items that you can touch and feel are all lovely and soft touch, and on this model we even get contrast stitching on the door cards and even up here, and on the seats themselves as well, which is this sort of nice gold color, which I think works particularly well with the platinum quartz. Of course, this isn't color matching with the body of the car, which is unfortunate because if I bought a red car, I'd like some red stitching. Now, being a family car, obviously space is a very important factor. And so in the CX-5, there is a pretty good amount of it. With this seat setup in my driving position, I have a good amount of knee room and a good amount of headroom as well. And because the front seats are mounted quite high, I can very easily tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, no matter how far back the seat goes, which means I get relatively good under thigh support, even though these benches are not quite as long as I'd like them to be ideally. Now, in terms of practicality, again, everything back here is pretty well catered for. You have those relatively large door bins here, a little pocket up here. You've got little pockets behind the seats, and you have a deployable center armrest with a couple of cup holders, a device holder here, and a shallow cubby here which hides the USB ports. Now, I'm not really sure why Mazda likes to hide the USB ports in the center armrest, because it does mean that if you have 5 passengers in here, you can't really use them. But at least you do get crotch coolers here in the center, which is nice. Now, if you get the highest spec CX-5, you can also get a sunroof in this car, which unfortunately we do not have. However, in terms of overall interior accoutrements, what you get back here at least is relatively standard. These seats, for example, fold 60-40, you get ISOFIX mounts. The doors themselves open relatively wide, almost to 90 degrees, which means fitting a rear-facing child seat shouldn't be too much of a hassle. And of course, because this car is, as I mentioned earlier, relatively large, even with a rear-facing child seat, you shouldn't have to adjust the front seat in order to make room. But the thing about the CX-5, or the reason why the CX-5 has been so popular among so many, is because there is a certain something about it that puts it a cut above the rest, which is a very important factor given the fact there is now a new Honda CR-V in town. So can this updated, older CX-5 match the new generation CR-V out on the road? Now, the CX-5 continues to be available in Malaysia with a variety of engines. Starting out the lineup is the 2-litre SKYACTIV-G petrol engine mated to a 6-speed SKYACTIV gearbox with power going to the front wheels. You can then move up to a 2.5-litre naturally aspirated version of that same engine, or you can get a turbocharged version of the 2.5-litre 4-cylinder. But the model that we have here is the 2.2-litre turbo diesel, dubbed the SKYACTIV-D. Now, this has long been a favorite for us in the Mazda engine range lineup. simply because we believe that this is the best blend of performance as well as fuel economy. Now, the thing about Mazda is that the way they make their engines means that their diesels, especially this one, operate a little bit differently from how you would normally expect. There's a much more linear torque curve, it feels a lot smoother, and more importantly, from inside the cabin, you hear nothing of it. So in terms of power outputs, a 2.2-litre turbo diesel again puts out a pretty healthy number and a very, very healthy amount of torque. But again, with power going to the front wheels via a 6-speed automatic gearbox, the name of the game here is about refinement. And I have to say that this is a very, very low stress engine. Even when you're setting off from a relatively low speed, you hear precious little of that engine and the power arrives in a very linear and very predictable fashion. And because it's very smooth, you don't hear anything of that engine, and so there is almost no telling from within the cabin that this is a diesel, aside from the fact that a full tank can do in excess of 800 kilometers. Now, the other benefit of buying the diesel model is that you will be buying relatively high up in the range. And so the model that we have on test comes relatively fully equipped, especially in terms of the safety features. So obviously this car will come with things like radar guided cruise control, autonomous emergency braking, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert with autonomous rear braking, as well as various other features, including the adaptive front lighting system that I mentioned earlier. And when you put all that together, it means that this becomes a very well-specified, very well-rounded package. It makes it into something that is very easy to recommend, and that's even before we get onto the driving dynamics. So Mazda has long prided itself on the fact that it provides some of the best driving and best handling vehicles on the market, at least within its relative segments. And the Mazda CX-5 is no different. When the CX-5 in its first generation showed up, it arrived on a scene where there were vehicles like the Honda CR-V, which at the time was a slow, ponderous, soft vehicle to drive, as well as the first generation Volkswagen Tiguan, which offered forced induction, but again, a relatively slow and leisurely sort of driving dynamic. And back then, the CX-5 was considered to be revolutionary. It brought a degree of dynamism to the mid-size SUV space. And so with this generation, and more importantly with this update, that is something that Mazda has intended has done its best to try and emphasize. So with this facelift, we now also get what's known as G Vectoring Control 2.0, which Burmaz assures us is a more refined, more updated version of the G Vectoring Control that has won multiple awards for how it's able to maintain body control and so on, while ensuring that passengers and drivers alike enjoy a smoother progression within the cabin. And I can say that despite the fact that this is a relatively large family SUV, it certainly doesn't handle like one. It's much more tidy, much more poised than you'd expect a vehicle like this, particularly if you've driven something like, say, the current generation Honda CR-V. This feels a lot more pointed, a lot sharper, a lot more focused to drive. And that becomes very clear from the moment you get in the car, let alone if you were to take it out on a slightly longer drive. I do apologize, I'm running on very little sleep at the moment. Now, when you're driving through twisty bits like I'm about to, you will feel that the car seems to control itself relatively well. Despite the fact this car's suspension is relatively comfortable, you don't feel a lot of body lean. And the reason for that is because the car manages to figure out very intelligently how to brake individual wheels in order to ensure that the body remains as level as possible. Now, what that means is, like I mentioned earlier, passengers will enjoy a much more comfortable ride and drivers will feel that the car is a lot more planted, a lot more stable, and a lot more predictable. This is obviously something that drivers and passengers will be able to appreciate. Now, on top of that, because this car has G vectoring control, it does mean that in essence, it also has torque vectoring of sorts. A very rudimentary torque vectoring by braking, no doubt, but it's torque vectoring nonetheless. And as a result, it means that again, progress is smoother and a lot more confident. The car figures out exactly where to put the power down and how to put that power down in a smooth and progressive fashion. But of course, when you're not driving it like your arse is on fire, which I doubt very many owners would, you'll be able to appreciate the fact the CX-5 is now even more refined than ever before. Truly, the CX-5 is a class above when you compare it to vehicles like the Honda CR-V and even the Volkswagen Tiguan Allspace, simply because the way this car goes about its business is so polished that you would be mistaken, or you'd be remiss rather, to think that this was a much more premium experience. In fact, I've driven premium luxury vehicles that are not nearly as quiet, as refined, or as polished as this. For starters, there is so little road noise that gets into this cabin, and the Toyo Proxys tires are not exactly famous for being particularly quiet, but there is very little intrusion in terms of road noise. And in terms of wind noise, there's almost none at all, at least not until you stray well past the national speed limit, which you shouldn't. And on top of that, there are little refinements within this car that make it feel really upmarket as well. Things like the window regulators, for example, something that I never mentioned in any video or any review ever, simply because it's inconsequential. But in the CX-5, the window regulators are almost silent. And in fact, even on full-size luxury saloons costing 700,000-800,000 ringgit, their window regulators are not nearly as quiet as this. And that sort of attention to detail is part of the reason why the CX-5 is as popular as it is, because customers recognize the fact that Mazda has put in a lot of effort in order to ensure that every single model that it sells is the most polished presentation that they can manage within that segment. And so driving the CX-5 around for the last few days, especially this diesel, has left me feeling very impressed. This engine, for example, this 2.2-litre turbo diesel especially, is very broady while still being very, very smooth and providing very, very good fuel economy. In fact, the car is returning about 13.5 kilometers per litre, which is very impressive for something with this sort of output. And on top of that, with the radar-guided cruise control, which also works in traffic, it just makes for a very easy, smooth, polished experience. This is a very easy car to live with day to day. It is comfortable, it's refined, it's efficient, and of course, like every other Mazda on sale, it comes with a 5-year warranty with 5 years free servicing, which means 5 years of hassle-free ownership. And compare that to vehicles like the Honda CR-V and the Volkswagen Tiguan Allspace, there is something to be said of this car. The Tiguan Allspace obviously is a larger vehicle with a longer wheelbase and an extra 2 jump seats in the back, but of course it doesn't provide the same sort of refinement the CX-5 does, no matter whether you get the 1.4 or the 2-litre Tiguan R-Line. And of course with the Honda CR-V, all you get is a 1.5-litre turbocharged engine, which no doubt is a very good engine and is very efficient in town, but when you're out on the motorway, it just lacks the top-end torque that you want in order to make you feel a little bit more confident, particularly when you're doing overtaking maneuvers or climbing up hills, for example, particularly with a full load. And if you're not quite too keen on the way the CR-V looks or drives, or maybe you don't like Honda as a brand, then you really don't have a better option than this. The CX-5, although ultimately is a relatively old car, and this is now, its second facelift in its lifetime, continues to present a very, very polished product. And as far as I'm concerned, I can understand why these cars are so popular, particularly within the Subang Jaya housewife set. But after having spent a week with it now, I think that appeal ought to be a little bit broader, because I think the husbands of those housewives probably have a little soft spot for the CX-5s they bought for their wives too. In any case, that's been our review of the 2024 Mazda CX-5, particularly the 2.2-litre turbo diesel High Plus. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. We will be back with more CX-5 content, particularly to talk about the 2.5 turbo petrol and all-wheel drive models. But we will see you then. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.